Kia ora koutou, ko Douglas Walker, tōku ingoa. I'm here today with the wonderful Kerry Allen, who is set up to do the last of our webinars on Level 2 Agriculture and Horticultural Science. And this webinar is focusing on the Land Use Achievement Standard in preparation for your upcoming exam. If you've got any questions during the presentation, just pop them in chat, and I'll either interrupt Kerry or I'll save questions to the end if they're not immediate, if they don't need an immediate answer. All right, so kia ora again, Kerry, and thanks. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Yep, so this is the last standard for Level 2 in preparation for your exam on Monday. So this is looking at understanding land use for primary production in New Zealand. Today we're going to focus on the revision areas of what is land use, what is the current use of it, what is the differences between the regions, what are some factors that affect that land use, and then looking at traditional land use, current land use, and future land use. Okay, so we'll just quickly go through the standard to make sure that you're fully aware of what needs to happen at each of their levels, the achievement levels. So firstly, looking at achievement. So here you have to demonstrate your understanding, and you have to explain factors that determine traditional, current, and future land use for primary production. So we will look at those factors, and you have to discuss at least two of those factors that determine that use, and therefore how that has impacted on the use. So here you have to relate it back to the regional or an area's land uses. So how that particular use has been influenced by that factor, and therefore what has happened in that region to do with that. So once we've looked at that factor, and I'll explain what the factors are shortly, we then need to have considered at least two either traditional, current, or future land uses for that area or for that factor. Okay, so that's so traditional, current, and future could be in the past, what is happening now, or what you predict is going to happen in the future, or where trends have been pushing it, that land use to change too. So moving on to merit. This is a detailed explanation. So remember, achieve is explain. This is a detailed or fully explained. So you have to basically state why that land use is carried out where it is. So what makes that primary production being grown in that particular area, and that's relating it back to those factors again. And then and stating how those factors are impacted by those particular things that occur in that region. So once again, you need to do a bit of linking, and once again, you need to have those words in the blue box that will link your achievement answer through to your merit answer. And then lastly, for excellence, you're looking at evaluating those land uses and those factors. So how that land use has been manipulated by those factors, and what of those factors have played a bigger role or is more important or has determined the use of that land. So this will require some justification or some comparing and contrasting. And once again, I've given you some excellence words there to make those links happen. Okay, so firstly, we just talk about land use. So we have to be able to use our land, and our land is how we use it is determined by where we choose to live, what food we want to eat, how we want New Zealand to look like. So we have a growing population, so where do we want to live? And also what parts can have things grown on it, in particular use for primary industries. So you'll see that picture there of New Zealand. It's showing you the land cover classes. So these are just generic classes that show you where predominantly the main land use occurs. Okay, so lots of indigenous forests and indigenous vegetation. Those are not covered in the standard. So we don't talk terribly too much about that because predominantly those areas may not have any primary production on them. But we do have some other areas such as exotic forests. So those are, you can see those in the Central Plateau. We have a lot of pastoral land. About 43% is made up of pastoral land. So that's our predominant agricultural areas. So here we're going to be predominantly looking at sheep and beef, dairy, deer, that type of thing. Then in those other areas we have in the blue areas and some other primary production for horticulture. And so these areas are your pip fruit, your stone fruit, your berries, some of your cropping, etc. So that's predominantly those areas. So where those things are in the country are determined often by their physical factors. And so physical factors we talked about 2 days ago. So these are things such as water, light, frost, etc. So we often determine where we can grow these things by those. So we'll spend a bit more time looking at physical factors in a moment. We also tend to have our production near our cities, or should I say, our cities are situated often where there is good productive land. And this is so that you didn't have to go far to produce your crops. So where crops are produced and where we want to live is often very similar places. Okay, so we'll just define land use in the terms of the standard. So there's all types, 3 types of land use that we're going to look at. And predominantly this is those 3 that already talked about, so traditional, current and future. And we need to cover at least those 3 are covered in the exam. So traditional are things that have been there for a long period of time or have been there before. So such as a lot of areas have been in pastoral, so been in sheep and beef, and then something's happened to mean they've changed land use. So tradition is what has been there commonly or in the past. Current is now. What is being done there now or could be slightly changing to in the next year or so, but what is there now? That is our current use. And future is what could happen to that land or what could it change to in the future, or a prediction. Sometimes we can base these on market trends, future needs, or potential possibilities, such as there is a lot more area going into hemp. So you might make a prediction on a future possibility of where hemp could be grown. With the climate change that we've been looking at, there is some trialling of peanuts and bananas. So you could predict places in New Zealand where both those crops could be grown, which currently are not grown commercially, but we're looking at those possibilities. So that is what we'd mean by future land use. What could we change it to, and what would be the reasons why we would do that? Okay, so we're going to move on to what is land being used for currently. So this is so a little bit of traditional and a little bit of current. So right now, our land use is used for a vast array of primary products. However, more than half of New Zealand's total land mass is used for agriculture and forestry. And out of that, about 55% of it is used for agriculture and horticulture. Sorry, out of all of New Zealand's land, is 45% of it is used for agriculture and horticultural use. So that's not determined with forestry. Now, out of that agricultural use, most of it is sheep and beef farming. So that's 31% of that total land area is sheep and beef. And that's followed next by dairying, so 9.8% of total land mass, and then followed on by forestry. Okay, so that's quite a big area. So then after that, we move into cropping and horticultural use. But they only make up about 2%, though they're highly productive. Okay, but and they have increased, that production area has increased over the last few years, most of it coming out of exotic grassland, and what we mean by that is pasture. So that horticulture area is increasing, and you can see hopefully on that diagram that I'm showing you there, those different land types. Okay, so moving on to the size and numbers. So these have fluctuated over the years. The number and size of farms and pastoral has decreased since 2002. And so therefore we have fewer animals and fewer farms. And this has been determined for a number of reasons, and we'll look at those factors shortly. But we have still been getting good prices for some of our products, particularly dairying. So you can see that the dairy numbers have increased, and the blue line on the second graph is show you that it is definitely increased from the 80s right through to nearly the 2000s, and then we've been on a slow decline. So those numbers have reduced by nearly 1 million animals over the last year or so. You can see there that sheep and in particular sheep numbers have decreased, but beef have as well. But sheep have decreased significantly. So they were at 6 million animals, and they have now moved down to about just under 3 million animals. So, we'll look at the factors and reasons why for that shortly. Okay, so each of the regions have different types of production. So I've just very briefly outlined this. I'm not going to go over each region and its land use. That is more for level 1. So if you have covered that in class, that's a good background for you of what occurs in each region. But you can see the regions there on that graph, and it shows you which regions have the most agricultural land, with Canterbury topping that significantly. So they have the most land that is used for agricultural production. Okay, then we move down into Otago, which is pretty high as well, and then into the Waikato and the Manawatu. Now, the numbers on the left-hand side where it says Otago is the highest, that is including all horticulture and cropping and forestry as well. Okay, so the graph on the right-hand side doesn't include forestry, so it's just a slight tweak there, and that's why the numbers are different. Okay, but all these regions that are outlined there have significant amount of their products produced in those areas, so more than 50%. Dairying occurs predominantly in Waikato and Taranaki, and some in Canterbury, and you can see there that's in there some areas for growing fruit and vegetables and berries, etc., and which is much smaller than those other industries. Okay, we're going to just quickly look at each of the major land uses, and so we're going to look at sheep and beef, and we'll put these together, and predominantly we put them together because most sheep and beef farms are not one or the other. They usually have a mixture of both of them, and the reason for doing this is because they live in very similar environments, and you can carry out their management practices in a similar management system. So that, and you also means you're able to diversify by having the two different livestock there. So we're going to just put these together because lots of farms cannot separate them out from sheep or beef. Now, the predominant breed in the North Island and southern parts of the South Island is Romney in terms of sheep. So these are what's used the most, and they're used for meat and for wool. So it's a general purpose wool breed. More specific wool breeds are merinos, and those are predominantly farmed in the South Island high country. Okay, very few, as I said, farmers devote themselves solely to beef, but the predominant beef cattle is actually Angus. And these are because they're hardy animals and they're able to live in mountainous high country places. So they're really good in the King Country and throughout the foothills of the Southern Alps, etc. Now, in addition to that, we also have beef that are produced from cull dairy cows in the bobby calf industry. So a lot of beef in terms of Frisian or Jersey beef is produced as well in this and is included in this section. Okay, we're also, New Zealand is the third largest producer of wool in the world, and we produce about 9.3% of that. So a lot of wool is produced from those sheep that we raise, and these are usually occur in November to January when they're shorn, and then we on-sell them. Okay, so it's just showing you some of those livestock numbers there. I haven't particularly talked about deer, but you can see that the biggest place for deer is in the Canterbury region, and in the South Island has 70% deer in terms of out of the country, with Canterbury and Westland being the highest. Okay, we're going to move on to dairying, and I didn't write a blurb here, but hopefully you can see these quick stats. So you can see that predominantly the Waikato is the biggest for dairying with 1.7 million cows. We have some other big regions such as Taranaki, which is 600,000, and same with Canterbury, which has another 600,000. So those are our biggest areas for dairying. Now, dairying is pretty important in the country because it employs so many people and it brings in such huge earnings for the country. So about 47,000 people are employed directly or indirectly in the dairy industry. And it brings in about $13.3 billion. Okay. Now we produce, as it states there, 3% of the world's milk production, but we're only the 8th biggest producer. Okay, so not a very big producer worldwide, but we do produce a lot of milk, and we can export predominantly most of that milk overseas. Okay, so predominantly most of those cows and that milk are found in the North Island, with predominantly most of it in the Waikato. And main reason for that is for the good growing environment. So those physical factors which allow us to produce good grass all year round so that we're able to feed those cows well. Okay, moving on to forestry. So this is our 3rd biggest industry. This also earns us a quite significant income of $6.9 billion in export revenue, and also employs a lot of people in the industry of 35,000. So that's in the wider industry. So these are produced predominantly in the Central Plateau. That's the biggest amount of land use, with about 500,000 hectares. And then we move into the other regions, with Canterbury and Southland being the next one. Now, Kaingaroa Forest, which was predominantly in the central North Island, it was the biggest forest, and this was due to its flat plains. And when they were first planted up in the earlier part of the century, it was found to have a cobalt deficiency and it didn't grow animals well. But at the time, we weren't aware of that, and hence it was put into trees. So that is a past traditional land use, and it has had some change to that. There's now some parts such as Riparoa that has been pulled out of trees and put into dairying, but predominantly most of it's still in trees. Okay, our biggest tree, our most common tree planted is Pinus radiata, or the pine tree, and 90% of that is from that tree. We do have other species growing, such as Douglas fir, but predominantly we export Pinus radiata. Okay, so you can see there down the bottom, looking at the planted forests, the little circle graph at the bottom, and showing you where those predominantly are. So see 33% is centred in the North Island, central North Island. So that's what we'd call the Central Plateau. Okay, so the forestry is a form of horticulture, but in terms of the stats, they pull those out, forestry out of horticulture. So when we're looking at horticulture, or talk about horticulture itself, it's everything else minus forestry. And often cereals are not in here either. So we call them arable, and I've pulled those out of these figures as well. So these graphs that we're about to talk about, these are just for every other plant crop. Okay, so predominantly your fruit, your veggies are going to be in, and some vegetable seeds, and also wine will be in here as well. So once again, this is a pretty big industry as well, 10 billion last year, and it is increasing. So we're able to sell more and more, and predominantly that increases in the kiwi fruit industry for fruit, and squash is our biggest vegetable export, and that goes predominantly to Japan. So these are growing, as you can see by that graph, all over the place, but you can see there's a lot of fruit is growing in different particular areas. You can see by the lines on those graphs. So Canterbury has a lot of things growing there, predominantly vegetables and potatoes, pea crops. We also grow a lot of seed varieties there, so carrot seed, clover seed, which we export, that type of thing. So a lot of seed crops are grown in Canterbury, and that's to do with its beautiful flat land and being able to irrigate to get those good yields. Okay, so main reason for those growing in those areas is shown by those physical factors. It's the bottom of each of those little tables. So it shows you there the rainfall, the sunshine hours, whether they have frosts or not, or how many days they get frosts, and also the heat unit. So that's growing degree days. So if you've been doing the physical factors unit, you will completely understand those. So it's just giving you an idea of what is growing where. Now, the next page, that graph I'm going to show you, might be a little bit difficult to see, but once again, it breaks those things down. Now, this one is looking at fruit, and it's breaking it down into those by regions. So showing you what different fruit is grown where. So you can see, for example, that in the Bay of Plenty, the top fruit producer is kiwi fruit. That will not surprise you at all. And then also, if we go to the Hawke's Bay, you'll see that apples is the biggest fruit production there, and that won't surprise you either. Okay, if we go down to wine grapes, we see that Marlborough is our biggest, followed by the Hawke's Bay. Okay, and that's probably not going to surprise you either. So it just shows you where those crops are grown and gives you an idea of what regions and why they are producing them in those areas. Okay, we're going to move on to vegetable production. So same type of graph, but just for vegetables. So showing you where these are grown. And as I said, our biggest export is squash, followed by potatoes. And you can see that predominantly squash, which is a type of pumpkin, is grown in the Hawke's Bay, followed by Gisborne. So that East Coast area is very important for that crop. And as I said before, they're predominantly exported to Japan. And then we have other crops we export, such as potatoes. So we see those in Auckland and the Pukekohe area, in the Waikato, in the Matamata area, and in Canterbury, which is the biggest production for potatoes. So you'll see those there. Most of those are for processing, so sold and for frozen chips, which we export, and also chips, crisps, potato chips, so used for processing industry. Okay, so, but you have all the other ones there showing you onions, for example, and Pukekohe and Waikato is the biggest for those. And then if we move to indoor crops, so that's on the right-hand side of the graph, you'll see that these are showing you by capsicums, cucumbers, salad greens, mushrooms, and tomatoes, where they're located in the country. So you can see Auckland plays the predominant role here, with a majority of those crops being produced there. So largest for capsicums and tomatoes. You see that Waikato also plays a predominant part, but you drop down into the Nelson and the Canterbury regions, and you can see that capsicums and tomatoes are also grown largely in that Nelson area, with cucumbers, salad greens, mushrooms, and tomatoes grown in Canterbury. And those are to meet those South Island needs. Okay, so some of them are exported, but predominantly they're all for our own domestic market. Okay, I'm going to move on to arable crops, and arable crops are predominantly wheat, barley, and maize grain, but there are a couple of others. But I just want such as barley and oats. But I said barley, but oats as well, which I haven't included on there, but they are in that group. Here, we grow a lot and predominantly for our own use. So we use them for bread, flour making, and for beer production, etc. So, and maize grain are used for predominantly animal feed, or some of it goes into flour, but predominantly, mostly for us, it is animal feed or growing seed to be sold for animal feed. Okay, so most of the maize grain is grown on the North Island, and that's because of our growing degree days and getting our crops to maturity. But wheat and barley are grown in the Canterbury region extensively. So, but you can grow them other places as well. So about, as I said, for arable crops, about 77% of those are in the South Island, predominantly in Canterbury. Okay, now I've been talking a lot about different factors, and I'm going to cover those factors now. We're going to go through each one of them. So you should be familiar with these factors. Hopefully they have already been covered in class. But basically there are 5 factors that determine or interact or work together to shape land use in this country. So these are economic, environmental, technological, social, political, and workforce. And I can't count, so that's actually 6. So we're going to talk about each one of those individually. Now, in the exam, you are definitely going to be asked about these factors, and you will need to be really knowledgeable, and each question will probably ask you for more than one factor. So I would go into the exam being really comfortable with at least 3 factors for each of the questions that you think might be asked. So thinking on future, current, and traditional land use. Okay, so we're going to cover some of these now. So first one, we'll start with environmental. Now, environmental is probably the biggest impact on where you can grow your crops. And reason for that is because of the physical factors, but also what sort of land it is, so the topography of the land. So highly productive land tends to be where it is good climate, suitable soils, and is flat and gently sloping. So that land is used for highly intensive horticulture, cropping, arable cropping, and some animal land use, okay, such as dairying, etc. Some places will require some irrigation, but mostly good growing land doesn't require irrigation. Okay, some flat land that has poor holding capacity of soil, so low organic matter, such as Canterbury, will require irrigation. So this land is highly sought after, and it's really important for growing crops such as potatoes, onions, and leafy green vegetables. So our lower producing areas, which are not quite so good, are usually used for growing livestock. And sometimes they're used for cropping if we can add irrigation to them. But basically, these are our best production lands because they're flat and we can get machinery on them. Now, all land in New Zealand is divided up into what we call land use capability classes. And I've got showing you those on that diagram there. So they're broken up into 8 classes. So these 8 classes are based on their soil properties, on their sensitivity to erosion, on their vegetation cover, and the steepness of their terrain. So 1 to 4 are the most suitable for cropping, and they're most productive for pasture and forestry. Okay, and you can see there that they all start high in the grey boxes. And we've categorized them into arable cropping, pastoral grazing, production forestry, and then into general suitability. Okay, so this land is highly sought after and wanted to grow primary products on. Now, a class 8 is right down the bottom there, and it's predominantly unsuitable for the majority of agriculture. And this land is often still classified as indigenous. It will still have forest growing on it, or it is very steep areas. So I'm thinking here of the high country stations across the high country of the South Island. I'm thinking of some particularly good forest areas in the North Island, so the Uraweras, that type of thing. So this land is not being utilised for primary production. And that will be for a number of reasons, maybe unsuitable due to erosion, soil quality might not be right, might be hard to access, it might be steep, etc. So predominantly, we are wanting to use the land that's great for primary products. So land classified 1 is the most versatile, and it has few limitations on how it can be used. 2 and 3 have some limitations. Okay, so you might not be allowed to do some things on it. Now, in terms of highly productive areas, we only actually have 5% classified in that highly versatile, highly productive area. So we want to look after them really well. And you've probably heard a lot about some of that land going into housing, which then can't be used for growing crops. So this is areas such as Pukekohe, it's areas around Christchurch, market garden areas sort of down by Wellington. Okay, these areas are highly fertile and grow really good crops. So we want to continue that. We don't really want to be putting houses on them. Okay, so I'm not going to talk hugely about physical factors, but these determine where your crops grow. So the whole unit on physical factors is wrapped up very briefly here in one slide. You can only really grow crops where they will grow well. So if they need growing degree days, then they need to be where that's suitable. If they need to be frost-free, then you need to grow them in those areas. Okay, so depending on what the crop requires and what your animals need to eat will depend on where you can grow your crops. Okay, so some areas will have regional differences, and I've got a picture here of Awakuni and Cromwell, and both of these have regional differences due to their environmental factors. And those physical factors, once again, determine the crop that grows there. So Awakuni is known for growing carrots, and this is because there's flat, fertile soils that have evolved from the volcanic eruptions from Ruapehu. And it is also cool because of its high altitude. And this gives a really good carrot. They grow straight and cylindrical, and they have a very high sweetness, and so perfect for high quality carrots. Cromwell is the same. It can grow really good stone fruit such as cherries, peaches, and apricots, and they predominantly have that because they require chill requirements. So they like cold, harsh winters, but they also need really hot, dry summers. And this brings out really good flavour in the fruit. They ripen really well and are really good eating quality. So hence those reasons for those crops being grown in those areas. And you'll see that as you travel around New Zealand, different places promote themselves based on their what they can grow in their crops. Okay, so environment also needs to be talked about in terms of land management. So how the land is being used. Okay, so depending on the land will depend on the way it can be used and the type of crop cycles, how often that soil can be tilled or fertilized, and what happens with the seasons and the conditions. So some places tend to get more drought, such as on the East Coast. Some places may need more fertilizer because they have very thin soils. So how you manage that soil or that area is going to be dependent on where you are in the country. And this means that some really fertile, really good places can be intensified. So some areas such as the Canterbury Plains has been intensified, same with the Waikato. And this is because we can add inputs to those areas such as fertilizer or irrigation. Now, 50 years ago, the Canterbury Plains were not used for anything other really than sheep and beef production. And the reason for that is because it lacks water. So the soils are very stony and they drain very quickly. However, they are good soils because they've been washed down from the high country and they're good alluvial soils. So once you've added the water, which is a limiting factor, then you get really good production and yields for cropping and growing crops. So once technology has been enabled or has enabled irrigation to be more intensified, this has allowed higher yields in different parts of the country to increase their cropping area. So we now crop the Canterbury Plains extensively. We also now put dairy farming on there as well because we now can grow the grass. However, with this intensification, there are some negatives. So there are positives such as good economics, good yield, but the negatives are that we have environmental issues. So there are some concerns about nitrates leaching through the soils into the water. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that just in a little bit more detail. So irrigation of the land is one of our big manipulations we do in the physical factor. So since 2002, irrigation, particularly for dairy farming, has doubled. So that's extensive. So we've also have irrigated for cropping, particularly in the Canterbury Plains. There's a little bit in Waikato, but not too much. Okay, and you can see there that I've written on the third bullet point down that I've talked about the difference between irrigated and non-irrigated. And it's found that there is some difference between them, that irrigated pastures has less soil carbon and nitrogen, and this may mean that there'll be less root growth, more decomposition of the organic matter, but also more release of carbon dioxide. Okay, so these may increase to increase nitrogen leaching. So they may have environmental impacts, and that's what we need to be aware of when we use our land. So what are these environmental impacts? We can have positive impacts and we can have negative impacts. So when we look at growing our primary products, we need to be mindful of what we are doing to the land. So positively, some land should go back into products that such as forestry or manuka for honey, etc., because they have high erosion. So these can be used for those products and are still providing an income. However, some land doesn't have very much organic matter, and you need to encourage the crops to grow on them, such as the Central Plateau with the a very thin organic layer topsoil because of its extensive volcanic activity. And then other crops might be seen as having a positive impact, and they'll be actively encouraged by local or regional government. So then we have primary products that have a negative effect on the environment. And these are such things as dairying with its high levels of nitrates and adding fertilizers to the water in the ground that will flow into waterways and effluent disposal. So we didn't know much about that prior to intensifying, and now we have a much better understanding of the negative impacts of this, and so most production is trying to curb and mitigate those negative impacts. However, we do still use water for irrigation, and this can lower streams or rivers or can cause eutrophication. But most councils are starting to look at putting on nutrient limits and water restrictions so that we have a more positive impact on the environment. Okay, so just following that up is just to add a little bit about soils. So we do need to continue to be mindful of what we're doing. So when we cut forestry land down, we need to be mindful of erosion, also of big storms and slash, because that can come down and cause devastation on the land that is below it. We do also need to be mindful of those nutrients that we use in our production, such as market gardens, and that it's not running off into our waterways. So I've just written a little bit more about those intensive land uses. Okay, lastly, and this is one that's current and going to probably play a bigger part in the future, and that is climate change. So here, we're not really sure of what the impacts are going to be, but we have had a fairly good indication that it will be higher temperatures, and therefore it will be a longer growing season, but it will mean less water, more likely to have droughts. We also need to be thinking about mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions. So these things might play a part and have some land use change if we are trying to solve some of these problems. And we're already trying to solve some of it by planting more trees. And I'll talk a bit later about the $1 billion tree project. But this has come in here trying in an indirect way to reduce climate change. Okay, so we're going to move now on to economic. So most primary production is done because we want to make some money. And the reasons for that is we need to live. So we will ideally choose crops that will make money. So we'll grow something in an area where we are likely to get good returns for it. So right at the moment, and in the past 20 years, dairying has been very profitable. And currently it's sitting at its highest price ever. So that's going to continue producers are going to continue to want to produce dairying because it makes good returns. But other crops such as kiwi fruit, they make good return, and people going putting into kiwi fruit is also increasing. So the Waikato is now getting more and more kiwi fruit grown here than we've had before. So we also have been directed by the government. They are wanting to increase export earnings by a further $44 billion in the next decade, and this is to help with the economic recovery from the pandemic, so from COVID-19. So we've been actively encouraged to produce more crops, and what that looks like, hopefully, is more cropping or more yield on a smaller land area. Okay, but we're going to have to do that sustainably, and that then moves back into that environmental factor. So some of these factors work together. Okay, so usually the more intensively the land is used, the greater the economic return. Okay, so if we look at economics, this is determined within itself on a number of factors. So how economic plays in land use, it has 7 factors. The first is profit. So most people are wanting to use the land to make profit. Okay, they don't want to do it just because it looks nice. So they need to weigh up those costs and those returns, and are they going to what's going to be the best bang for their buck. So they'll compare different land uses and choose the one that's best for them. They'll then look at this setup cost, the capital costs. So, for example, a dairy shed costs $1 million. So if you don't have a dairy shed already on your property, you need to make sure that you have the capital in which to invest. Moving into a different market, maybe seed production for carrots might be less infrastructure, so less development, and you might be able to get seasonal finance for that. So that might be a better option. You need to look at the markets. Is there a market for your product? Or in the future, is there going to be a market for your product, such as I discussed hemp earlier? And how far away are you from that market? And then moving into infrastructure, what is set up already for your product? So if you're looking at dairying, there's lots of processing already set up. There's servicing industries, there's marketing firms. However, if you're moving into hemp, where are you going to process that? How are you going to get it to market? What's your transport going to look like? So all of these things determine whether you go into a primary product or not. And then moving into access to information. So there's a lot of information out there about dairying and sheep and beef. But if you're moving into a new crop or to a proposed land use change, there might not be so much information. So you have to be able to find that technical advice. And if a person doesn't feel comfortable with that, they're not going to risk moving into a new crop. They will stick with what they know. Equally, the same with getting labour. Now, labour, you need skilled labour, and if you're changing crops, that can be difficult to find that skilled labour. So if you have got dairy farming or you're dairying currently, all your labour understands dairying. However, if you decided to change to grow alpacas, they might not be who you want to help you run alpacas because it's a completely different land use, and therefore they're no longer skilled in that land use activity. So you might have to change staff. So you need to be aware of the costs and what's involved with that. And then lastly, looking at land tenure. Now, not all farmers own their land. If you're looking at potato production, that has a 7-year cycle. So you cannot grow potatoes in the same paddock as you did last year for another 7 years. So most potato growers do not own their land. They lease it or they have a tenure over it. Now, depending on how long that tenure is will depend on what sort of land use you choose. You're not going to put multi-million-dollar structures on a land use that on land that you only have for a couple of years. So if you have it for a long time, you're more likely to put infrastructure on it. If you've only got it for a short time, you're just going to do a crop that you can, or animals that you can just put on quickly and remove and make a short-term income. Okay, so we've talked about investment briefly, but I just want to highlight that some crops have huge investments, such as viticulture and kiwi fruit. So they can be up to $50,000, $60,000 a hectare to set up because you have got drainage and you've got shelter belts and irrigation. You also need to purchase a license to grow gold kiwi fruit. And last year, gold kiwi fruit licenses were up to $500,000 a hectare. So this is huge investment, and so you need to be able to get returns from your investment. Dairy farming is also expensive. Milking sheds cost $1 million. It's probably $1 million of fencing and probably $1 million or $500,000 in terms of your livestock costs. So you need to be aware of that before you go in. So less intensive land use costs you less, and they have less running costs. So sheep and beef tend to be less running costs and less investment. Okay, so intensification, as I said earlier, the more intensified you have, the better yields you have, the better economic returns. So therefore, that is why there is a change from sheep and beef to going to dairying, because it has more returns. But also, as I discussed earlier, with that access now to water through irrigation, that yield is higher and now you get way better returns. So intensification has occurred right across the country, and it was very controversial in the Mackenzie country when they were trying to convert that into dairying. So they have now irrigated some parts in the Mackenzie country, but some of the big farms have been turned down. But the first dairy farm opened there with centre pivots in 2003, okay, and caused quite a bit of social disruption. Okay, so we'll move into social values. So this is what the values that people place on the land and how they value it. So here it's looking at the each of those people and what they use that land for and what production. So generally we're trying to get an income from it, but usually it's somewhere where you work and you live, and you're wanting to have both material gain, but also your social connections are connected to that land. Okay, so depending on how long your people have been on that land will depend on how much you value it. Okay, so some have long connections. Where I'm from, we have our farm. Our farm's been in our family for over 100 years, so we have a deep connection with that land. So also changing land use can cause some issues. Yes, they can give new opportunities, but sometimes families may not be very comfortable with changing land use because they don't have those expertise, or they have a personal preference. So if you've been sheep and beef and then it's going to convert it to forestry, that might cause some issues, both within your family but also within the community, because you lose those traditions that have occurred before and you're now going to have to make new ones. Now, Maori have particular values and well-being, and they are connected to the land. So they have a Maori worldview, so Te Ao Maori, and they use the whenua in a very different way. So they believe they are fully connected to that land, to the taio, which is the environment, and they pass on their mataranga Maori, their knowledge about the land. And they think themselves as kaitiakitanga, which is caring, or kaitiaki, the guardians, caretakers of that land. So they play a different role once again, and more people have that social value, those social of being looking after a land. So looking after it and giving back and having a reciprocity. What the land gives you, you give back. So that's a value that has been is continuing to evolve. But we also have social license to farm. So we need to be looking after our land, and we need to be doing that in a social and ethical manner. So this is now what we call the social license to farm. So this is where social or society pressures are being increased, and if society doesn't like it, they will now tell you. Okay, so some things are more acceptable to the urban or to people in general than other ways to use the land. So poultry and pig farming is less encouraged in comparison to other properties. Same with dairy farming, has been seen to be less appropriate than some other methods of farming. Now, the big one for us is socially, it's a good employment. And as we said earlier, 45,000 people are employed in the dairy industry. So we have a lot of people employed in the primary industries, okay, right across the sector. So they could be working on farm, but they could be working in the secondary, so processing, transport, in those service industry, consultants, etc. Okay, so it does ensures that we can live well. So it gives us a good standard of living. Our whole economy and our social employment is based on the primary industries. And because of that, that means we have adequate food and shelter and income. Okay, so this is just talking about what happens here if that changes. So some changes in land use means that there's a change of employment. And I talked a little bit about that before. So if you change from sheep and beef to dairying, such as what happened in Southland, then that transition can be quite difficult for some communities, because they're predominantly being employed in the sheep and beef. And then suddenly they need to upskill, or they need to find new employees who are skilled in the dairy industry. However, some of that provides new job opportunities, such as the Bay of Plenty when I was a child was predominantly dairy farming, and that has now converted to predominantly kiwi fruit and very few dairy farms. So that provides new job opportunities and new upskilling. So Te Puke is renowned for having kiwi fruit and being highly skilled in that field. And we also have the issue of urbanisation. So we have encroaching cities, towns taking some of our really good land. So we need to be mindful of that. Urban land increased by 15% over the last 20 years, and most of that is conversion from grassland into the urban use, so put into housing. Okay, some of that was good horticulture land, so 9% of it predominantly in the Auckland area. And so we want to make sure that these lands are not our highly productive, versatile lands, our Group 1 and Group 2, because we can't get those back. And those areas produce really good cropping land. And it's more difficult and going to be more expensive if you're producing those crops in poorer land. So we just need to be aware of that urbanisation. Okay, so looking at workforce considerations. So as we talked before, this provides a huge amount of workforce considerations for us. And so we need to be able to provide those jobs. If we can't get people to work in our area, then we also are able to source workers from the Pacific Islands, and this is the recognised seasonal employer scheme. And so we get about 14,000 people in that from the Pacific Islands to help work in our industries. So really good because we're able to pick and harvest our crops. So moving on to regulation, and this is becoming more and more. So this is where rules and regulations have been put down so that different crops can grow in different areas, or there's been restrictions on crops in different areas. So most councils have got nitrogen discharge limits, they've got water limits, they've got carbon. So this is one of the schemes that was implemented, which is the $1 billion tree scheme. So this was trying to get 1 billion trees planted by 2018. Okay, so regional councils play a huge part in that. They determine what can and cannot do. The biggest land use scrutinies is dairying, following by any of the factory type farming, such as pigs, poultry, egg, and mushroom production. So predominantly those have smells, and people don't like living where those smells are. But also restrictions on water and consents for that water and effluent discharge. So those are being put out by the regional councils. But city councils also have those. So those are on the fringes of towns. So in the Christchurch area, tomato growers who were using coal for heating, they generally had to move away because the council had implemented clean air regulations, and they weren't going to be able to meet those. Most of those tomato growers, etc., are now converting to more sustainable heating uses, such as wood or wood pellet burners. But those are some examples of those political interventions. And of course, they don't come cheaply. So we have those compliance costs and minimum wages, etc., and they all come at a cost. So have to be mindful of that when they're implemented. Okay, moving into technological. Now, this is a big one, and I've given lots of examples here, but technology plays a huge part on what production is done. So talked about irrigation. This is new cultivars or new pruning systems. This is aerial top dressing that was, started in the 40s and 50s and 60s. That's allowed us to have higher production on those hill country areas and therefore have higher stocking rates. You can see that diagram there showing you what's happening with all the irrigation throughout the country. So that's allowed those crops to be there. And then I've talked briefly about cobalt. So bush sickness, we now add cobalt to our fertilizers. We've looked at growing crops in glass houses, so fully computer controlled. We manipulate adverse weather conditions such as frost and hail. We add rotary and effluent systems for herds. We do a lot of breeding in terms of plants and sheep. We look at new techniques to drain. We look at self-driven tractors. so that we can get cultivate done, and we look at drilling down into our deepest aquifers. So those are all things that manipulate cropping, so we can use them to our advantage. So precision agriculture is another one that we can use to ensure our inputs are utilised in a sustainable way. Okay, moving on now to looking at the different land uses. So this is just a generic overview. So we have traditional land use and moving to current land use. Now, I've just picked one example, and this is forestry land going to agriculture. So in the Central Plateau, we have a predominantly Kaingaroa forest, had a lot of area in Pinus radiata. The market dropped out of it in the beginning of the 2000s, and therefore it wasn't as profitable as it had been before. So therefore, companies like Carter Holt Harvey, therefore started to change and convert that land back into dairying, because dairying was making a lot of money. So the influence was economic, and that is why there was that change. So a lot of land got converted back into normal agriculture and to dairying in particular. Okay, it did come with some issues because we had to pay our greenhouse gas emission liabilities, which was under the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, looking at changing land use. So right now there's a whole lot of drivers that cause land use to change, and that, as we've talked about, all those factors can be those drivers. So we need to be mindful that land use is not static. It's not going to be the same forever. It's going to change. But some reasons why they do not change is because of traditional land uses. Can be caused problems from it, such as compaction or contamination. Sometimes you can't change them now because of those. Other ones is because the cost of conversion is too high. $1 million for a milking shed may not make converting to another land use appropriate because you may not be able to cover your costs. And also, it's making sure that that other form of land use is going to continue to be profitable. So you don't want to change and wait for it, because remember, you're going to takes time to breed, or takes time for trees to mature, takes time to produce fruit. So you might not find that in the interim it's profitable to do so. So some producers will not want to wait. So there are some reasons for maintaining the current land use as well. But one of the current trends that's occurring right now is changing from dairying into vegetable growing. So right now there's a lot of land that has been in dairying or marginal for dairying and is converted back into veggie growing or back into sheep and beef heifer grazing. Some of it's going into kiwi fruit, avocados, and some of it's the worst of it is going into trees, into forestry. Okay, so that's a current trend. Now, predicting land use changes, that's quite difficult. We usually base these on market trends, so what we think is going to occur, or some social trends. So socially, dairying hasn't had that license to operate recently, so lots of dairying places has changed from cow dairying into sheep or goats or even deer. So some of those land use changes will occur because of those. So I've got you just a little bit of information there about those changes. These will have positive and negative effects on the community. Positive if they're going to be bringing in jobs, negative if the jobs are going away. So there's been a lot of talk about forestry that tends to remove jobs out of the community. So that has a negative impact on the community initially. Okay, so there's lots of reasons of why you would change, and it has huge impacts on those rural communities. Okay, so those are just some examples of land use change, and you would have gone over a lot more with in your class. So those are that's the achieved in merit, and I'm just now going to move into the last couple of slides on excellence. So here you need to be able to evaluate. Oh, I haven't changed that topic. Don't ignore that. We'll just jump quickly. So I pulled a slide from the physical factors, and it doesn't look like I've changed it. But we need to be able to evaluate by justifying or comparing and contrasting or stating which factor is the most important on the impact of land use, depending on the scenario. So I've given just some scenarios for each and some things that you could consider. So for economic, you might look at reduction of labour or high prices, or the cost of conversion, or the initial land setup, or labour shortages, so you're going to have to pay more for labour. So these are the things that might play a part in the economic justification for or against a particular crop or land use change. Then environmental, same type of thing. You might be keeping that land use, or you might change to it because it has flat, fertile, well-draining soil. That the soil is really good for that particular production because it has good water supply. It could be that you are looking at disposal of waste products, so that's a negative and you need to be able to get rid of them. It could be that some of the crops are carbon sinks, and so that's going to be really good for carbon emissions. It could be that this crop is no longer wanted to be grown because of the runoff that it has from fertilizer. Okay, so those are some of the environmental considerations. Looking at social, so you're going to try to increase employment if you put up hail netting, so that means more spending in rural communities. It brings more money in employment if you add irrigation. You might need to be bringing in workers, and this means that in your area you will have more accommodation providers, you'll have more students in schools, you'll have better facilities, better services, the banks will be there. Okay, so these sort of things are what you need to be thinking about when you're looking at that land use and for social. Okay, you might be having been able to buy closer to where you work because they're able to break up some of that land into selling it for houses. And then moving into technology. So some of these things such as providing new drought-resistant grass varieties, utilising water resources and irrigation, having precision agriculture, so you're much better at being precise with your inputs and not wasting it. So these might be a justification for or against particular land use. And last two, workforce considerations. Obviously, you're wanting to have jobs. So the closer you are to a workforce, the better that you're going to have. So a justification might be close to urban market, or it could be that you putting in something and therefore you're going to be able to supply more jobs and need highly skilled people to work them. And having that support industry is going to be really close. So a conversion, for example, in the Waikato of dairying would mean that you have access to all those things. Okay, and lastly, political. So justifying for political could be because it's been mandated and it's going to be better for the environment or better for social sustainability. It's going to be better for our people. It could be that future taxes are going to be introduced on emissions, and therefore that's going to have an impact on your nitrogen use on your cropping. So you might have to now look at your costs and associated with that. It might be that you need resource consents now to actually have or carry out that type of land use. So you have to be aware of all these things, and that might be a good thing or a bad thing, and that might mean you stay with the crop or the land use that you have, or you may change. Okay, so that's it. Those last ones are just some ideas for political. You have to be able to justify it. Obviously, all of them are going to be dependent on the question and the land use that's been asked in the exam. So, but basically, you just need to be able to justify and compare and contrast those factors and then back it up with some facts and figures on why you would do it. So hopefully that's been helpful. A crash course on land use.
Awesome work again, Kerry. Thank you so much. So that brings to the end the third of the three level 2 webinars you've done for agriculture and horticulture. And I just want to thank you on behalf of all the students and teachers who will use this resource, not only this year, but in the future. Really appreciate all the time and effort you've put in, a massive amount of detail. And I'm sure that that will be useful to a wide range of people in the future.
No problem. It's been great to be able to do it. I hope it gets a lot of use by the students for next week.
Very good. And if you're watching, best wishes for your exam next week. And feel free to leave a comment thanking Kerry for her hard work. Thanks, Kerry.
Okay. Good luck. See you.